Hi guys, it's Melissa. So this video is going to be intended about post-traumatic stress disorder and what does that detail. So post-traumatic stress disorder can look different from each one of us. What I'm realizing is that a lot of people are afraid to discuss their trauma. We do a scale where so we be like, we may be suffering, right? But we measure it against another individual. We be like, well, we didn't have it as bad. However, not that it's not levels of trauma and traumatic events, but the thing is, if you're experiencing any type of confusion, any type of doubt, any type of dissociation, why is it that you don't think your trauma is as significant as another person? Regardless if this person may have more of a severity of complex trauma to your lens, but if you're suffering and you're not feeling well and you're disassociating and you have confusion and you're in a cloud and you're in your head, then why will you not take your trauma just as serious as the other individual? A lot of us that goes into people pleasing mode feel like that our trauma are not always as significant. So we don't like to communicate about it, or we may have been silent about it. I'm going to put me out there. So for a long time, I didn't understand my trauma because my trauma was with my little cousin. It was sexual. I want to say sexual abuse because we was not conscious. She was like 3 or 4. I was like 6 at the time. And I can't really determine the age due to my little cousin. She was adopted out. So the date of birth that we have on file for her and the date of birth when she went into the service adoption is different. But you know the years can always get mixed up. Long story short, she was heavily sexually abused. She reenacted the act with me, forced me to do something. I felt so much shame, so much guilt about it. It created so much confusion that I didn't know what to think of it because no one talks about the younger child reenacting stuff with a little bit of an older child. And it wasn't like I was that much older than her, but it just created so much confusion because I'm like, how did this 3 or 4 year old take advantage of me at 6? Well, I have no experience with sexual abuse. I didn't really know what that was. She did and was exposed to a lot. And then once I started to dig into the family's history, it came out more. It came out more. What I'm saying is that our traumas are not direct. Our traumas can be leaving us in confusion state, in a state of not understanding. Or then, for a long time, I'm like, well, I shouldn't complain because at least it wasn't an adult. And I was like, but it made it more confusing because it was a younger child. So it left me in a state of fogginess, a state of unprotection, a state of not knowing, like, am I going to be to blame? And not to mention the guy I was with was trying to say, oh, well, you were 6, you're to blame. And I'm like, it's left me more in a state of confusion, of not knowing, leaving me in the unknown, questioning myself, questioning my morals, questioning everything that the literature that I read, not to mention everything that you read in the books, of sexual trauma and things of that nature. Like, oh my God, if you were, molested, or I mean, not, I don't want to use molestation, but let's say if you were the older child and you was the one reenacting and then you kept doing it, and all of these things that are inconsistent with theories. And I'm not saying that it's not no truth or validity to the older child sometimes, continuously the behavior, but they're not discussing the detail. When we're talking about the older child, we're talking about teenager versus kid. We're talking about more graphic details. We're talking about someone who goes untreated. We're talking about someone who normalizes the behavior. So it's so much things that goes into play, but they don't give you the detailed description of what everything is. Not to mention, when you're at anywhere between like 8 or 9 and under, you're in a hypnotic state. What that means is that you're not even currently present. So you consciously cannot be aware. Your brain does not fully develop until the age of 25. So you cannot consciously be aware of anything that's really happening at any of those age. You can remember things, but you're not going to fully grasp everything. What I'm saying is that a lot of people have traumas that they feel as though is not as significant, but yet they suffer in silence and say, hey, this people got it worse and I shouldn't complain. However, the person is suffering. However, the person pains is valid. And my thing is, as a clinician, is like, well, if you're suffering and your pain is valid, and I know it's valid because I'm witnessing it transpire, why are you dismissive of your pain? Because it's not as severe as another person. Will you have wanted to be more severe? And a lot of us tend to hide behind other people's lens, other people's views. And instead of owning, like, this really hurt me. This really impacted me because it left me in a confusion state. And it made me, all the literature and things like that didn't really align with this. Or I didn't have enough data for this. Or I didn't know that can be considered trauma. Or I didn't really understand this. And you're not the only one out here with these type of issues, first off. What I'm communicating to you is that we all have different types of trauma. How it's rated, how it's looked at, it doesn't matter. If something happened to you that was not in alignment with your body, with your being, with how you feel, then it is trauma. And you have a right to feel how you feel. Don't let society project onto you how you should feel. Don't let elders say, or family or friends who don't understand the impacts of trauma. And it could be sexual trauma, it could be physical trauma. It could be simple as neglect. And I'm gonna say it's simple, but I like even neglect, even not person not paying attention to you. All of those are trauma. But a lot of us feel like that we don't have a right to discuss our traumas if they're not as severe as other people's traumas. That we don't have a place. Even with myself, I felt the same way for years. And you have to be your voice. You have to be your victor. You have to be your protector. Because if you do not protect your story, if you do not protect yourself, if you do not protect the reality of what happened to you, then no one is. And it's not their responsibility to. If something happened to you, you have to learn how to defend yourself against societies, against yourself, against sometimes the literature that you read, because it can get confusing depending on what the trauma is. Some things are not black and white. When I was discussing even my scenario, right? It was a younger child that did this to me. I was about 6. I didn't have no idea. And, of course, you're like, well, what is people going to think? What is people going to say? And what are people going to feel? And what does that mean about me? All of these things came into place, not knowing that that was a form of sexual trauma that I couldn't process. And if I try to go back there, I would have flashbacks and triggers. You cannot go back to the event. You have to stay in the present time because what happened already happened. And it didn't make sense then. So why would I try to go back and try to make sense of it now? When we're talking about complex trauma and we're talking about traumatic events, we look at it from the lens of the present. So that way we can see it from a different lens versus going back. Because if you try to go back into the trauma, you can get stuck and pulled into the trauma. That's when you get the triggers. That's when you get the flashbacks. That's when you get the intrusive thoughts. That's when you get the fear. Because all of those symptoms were real when the traumatic event happened for you. So don't put a measurement in trauma. Don't measure your trauma. And I hope this video makes sense. This was a general video describing how certain traumatic events may not be looked at as trauma compared to in a greater scheme of other people's traumatic events. When we compare our traumas, when we dismiss our own traumas, when we invalidate our own experience because it's not as significant as someone else as we were look at it like, or we shouldn't feel this type of way because someone told us, well, we shouldn't feel this type of way, or someone projected onto you or made you feel worse about your trauma. Know your story, understand, walk in it, protect your story. My story is I was impacted by a younger child, and that is the facts. And the reason why was because my younger cousin was exposed to sexual trauma at a very early onset age, to the point that she was removed from my aunt's house and brought into another family's home and completely adopted out. Her whole identity changed, even the year of birth. So when I went looking for her, I could not look for her under her real name. that person no longer existed. She was given a whole new name. When I found my cousin, she was buried under a new name. She committed suicide at the age of 14. So it was a lot of things that possibly happened to her that I would never know. The only reason why I know something happened is because of the reenactment that she did to me. And how it left me confusion, how it left me perplexed. How I'm like, how did this younger child like take control? Or how did she know all this stuff? And how did she manage to like persuade me or make me? Like, how did this, it's like in this thing. But a lot of people was like, at least it was a younger child. At least it wasn't an adult. At least, at least, like, all of these things. Like, oh, you were so young. Like, basically justifying it. And I'm like, it doesn't take away how I feel that I felt like something was done. And I'm not blaming my cousin because she was too little to understand. She was just reenacting the behavior. But I'm not taking away the reality of what I experienced either. Because when I do that, that's like saying that her experiences were more valid than myself. You do not want to do that in trauma. You want to recognize both the experiences. This is not a blame game. But this is something of a lens, whereas though when I was like looking for help or assistance or not professionals that couldn't help me. So most people like just forget about it, get over it, and then other people was like, oh, at least it wasn't an adult, And I'm like, well, if it was an adult, I would have made sense. The adult was in the wrong, because they were still a lot older. When it was another kid that's a little younger, it left me more confused because I'm like, what does that mean? Like, how did she manage to do this? And whether people was going to believe me. Because I'm the older child. So are they going to believe that I got taken advantage of this younger child? And then I'm like, I don't care what people believe now. Because I know what happened in that story. I was the one in it. We don't talk about this story. And if it happened to me, then it happened to others. And I am my protector. And no, I'm not blaming her and I'm not blaming myself at this point in age. Of course, I'm understanding the lens of sexual trauma and the significance of it and how it impacts us all and how everyone is not going to always understand everything. But don't take your own trauma, that whatever you've been through, and brush it under the rug. Do not be dismissive of your trauma. Do not acknowledge it because it wasn't as severe as another. If it impacted you and it affected you, then it is severe. If it causes confusion and doubt, disassociation, and triggers and flashbacks of who you are as a person, then yes, it's important. I see this in sometimes with my clients where they disregard their own traumas. And it's like, no, don't do that. They're like, or they look at it from, well, what other people are going to think. And it's like, it doesn't matter what they think. It's about how you feel. Why is it that somebody else's feelings trump your own feelings? And I had to, get with myself as I continue to go into counseling myself. So I continue to be a better clinician. I have to start telling my story so that people can understand. It is not the black and white story. It is not the typical story. But that's what makes it so unique. Is that it's a different story that needs to be communicated and that I can help another kid out. Because this also happens when a younger child does perpetrate onto the older child. And the older child may not understand what's going on. And when I mean child, I mean like younger age, really young age. Understanding the child's character comes into play, their behavior comes into play, the positives comes into play, experiences come into play. So you have to understand it from a different lens. So that's just a gist of take your trauma seriously. Don't measure it against another person's trauma. Don't justify your trauma or make it dismissive because somebody else's trauma is worse, and then you're trying to make sense out of something, justifying it because it's not as bad. Don't do that. If you experience an inch of confusion, an inch of doubt, that's your trauma. That's your story. Take your reality and trust yourself. Trust your intuition. Don't put your trust in others. Be your own advocate. Because if you experience pain, then your pain is valid. Regardless if it's not considered significant to the world or to others as you perceived. Thank you. Have a great day.